The game has begun. Magnus Carlsen comes to the board. 1 e4 has been played by Rauf Mamedov. We can look at the position. Knight, bishop, bishop, rook, queen, king, knight and rook. Magnus is currently on 7 points out of 7 and this is the 8th round. He's playing with the black pieces. What is the move that he's going to play against Mamedov is the big question here. He takes his time for his first move. He can respond back with the symmetrical e5. There's also the possibility to play Scandinavian with d5 or even play the Sicilian with c5. Not at all easy to know what will he do. Magnus has already taken 9 minutes for his first move. That's why the freestyle chess is so tough. c5 played. Opening up the bishop. This is now a Sicilian, but you have to realize that the pieces are all scrambled up. Although the pieces which have maintained their position from normal chess are rook, knight, bishop, and he goes knight f3. He's going to play d4 here perhaps and go for the open Sicilian. But this move already is slightly inaccurate because Magnus can strike in the center and he finds it. d5 is an excellent move. If you push forward with e5, I can later on even break it with f6. So Mamedov takes on d5 and of course he's hoping for rook takes d5 when c4 followed by d4 would give him a very good position. But Magnus has a very powerful move here up his sleeve which is knight to b6. He attacks the d5 pawn with his knight and he's hoping for a move like bishop g4, pinning here. And there is no c4 available. So this position already looks slightly difficult for Rauf. He kind of risks getting into a passive position and that's the reason why he plays d4, attacking in the center. Now Magnus has two options. One is he can push his pawn to c4 and then later on pick up the pawn on d5. The second is that he can give a check to the king, which he does. He gives a check and now you can't block it. If you go king g1, you've lost the right to castle, which is not a great thing to have. So you will have to trade queens. And is trading queens a good thing for white in this position? Good or bad? He has to do it. He plays queen e2 here. And now Magnus is going to get what he loves very much. A queenless endgame. Here king takes e2. You could say this is a queenless middle game actually, because there are still a lot of pieces on the board. And now a very important move here to play pawn to c4 and he finds it. So now knight takes d5 followed by b5, a5, b4, expanding on the queen side is the best idea here. He plays his pawn to c3. Rauf Mamedov risks here getting into a passive position. Knight comes out to f6. I love how Magnus is playing this here. Knight on f6, attacking the pawn on d5. And knight to c2. The knight actually starting to come into the game, wants to get to e3, maybe put pressure a bit on c4. Magnus doesn't even take the pawn yet. He goes bishop f5, a good move here, pinning the knight. The knight cannot move easily here. Knight e3 would mean that the bishop is hanging. So the pawn on d5 still cannot be taken. Knight a3 played. Rauf is exchanging pieces. The question is whether this is good for him or not. Magnus takes on b1 and knight takes on b1. And now finally he chops off the pawn. Knight takes d5. A very, very small edge here for black. But is it enough to convert the position into something tangible? Time will tell. Pawn to g3 played by Mamedov. He takes away the f4 square from the knight. And Magnus now, e6 is possible, but he goes f6, and which is a very interesting move because the f6 pawn controls the movement of the knight on f3. He plays his knight to d2. And he's putting pressure here, but more importantly, he wants to go to e4 followed by c5. At this point, we are no longer playing freestyle chess, right? Like, we are playing a position which could very well arise out of standard chess. Rook c8 played. And now knight to e4 played by Rauf. He's planning to get in here. And maybe knight a4. Stopping knight c5 is a good idea. But Magnus prefers bishop d6 and he gets his final piece into the game. Final minor piece. Now knight c5 not possible. If knight takes d6, he'll take back with the pawn. And Rauf goes king d2 here. He wishes to maybe put his king on c2 square. Maybe with c3 pawn defended, he wants to break with b3. There are many possibilities. And so Magnus now tries to focus in. He has 20 extra minutes on the clock as compared to his opponent. And after quite some thought, he pushes his pawn to f5. And I guess the knight must take the bishop. That seems very logical. Knight takes d6, e takes d6. And we'll reach that position. So he takes, knight takes on d6. And Magnus comes back to the chair and immediately takes back e takes d6. The position has changed a bit. You can see that these squares are no longer available. The bishop has been traded for the knight. The black knights look really good on d5 and b6. How should you continue this position as white is the question. Do you still go for b3? I don't know if b3 is a good idea. He goes rook e1. That's a good move actually. He's trying to maybe look at getting into e6, doubling the rooks down the e file. So perhaps stopping it with king f7 makes a lot of sense. And Magnus stops it. He goes king f7, connects his rooks. Endgame play is a lot about doing things step by step. King c2, opening up the bishop. Because if you do things step by step, it is quite possible that your opponent could go wrong and you can get an advantage. Knight now goes to d7 and maybe not the most accurate move as per the engine. It prefers maybe something like knight a4, but knight d7. Knight goes to d2. Rauf is maybe looking for ways to activate this knight. Although from f3 it can't go here, from d2 it can't go here. Magnus continues his plan of pushing the pawns on the queen side. He plays b5. How should white activate the position? And g4. What a move by Mamedov. His idea is that after you take, he wants to jump in here, attack this pawn. If you defend, he wants to give up another pawn with f3 or h3. And this position can get very nasty. So knight 7 f6 is an excellent move by Magnus. He's asking this pawn to take a decision because he wants to take it. And secondly, if you take on f5, he wants to go back knight e7 and pick this up with his knight. It's just an incredible move, this knight f6. It also shows how Magnus understands this position so deeply. It's a beautiful, beautiful move. Rauf takes, g takes f5. And it's time to go back knight e7. And once the knight takes this pawn, it will be beautifully positioned on the f5 square where none of the white pawns can actually kick it away, which makes it really, really strong. So knight goes to f3. And now the plan is to maybe give this check. So do you want to stop it with h6? Because if you stop it, I'll go to h4 and protect my pawn. Well, Magnus is already ready with his move. Knight takes f5. He takes it. He's like, if you give me a check, I'll go here, maybe king g6. If you attack me even further, I'll play h6 and you have no good discovered check. So the move knight g5 is played. And is Magnus going to go to g6 is the question. Well, not really. He goes king to g8. He pushes his king backwards. It's a good move there. And now the knight comes back to e4. He's eyeing the d6 pawn. And I think Magnus would chop off that knight. Yes, he takes it. Knight takes knight. Rook takes knight. Again, king f7. I think you need to get your king back into the game. He gets his king back into the game here. And now rook h e1 seems like the move. For Rauf, he has the play on the e file, but the problem is this knight controls the e7 square, so it's very difficult to get anything moving here. So he plays his rook to e8. Now, think about this endgame. Rook takes rook, rook takes rook, rook takes rook, king takes. And this is actually very difficult for white to hold because the black king can start moving in. So maybe it's important for white to not exchange. That's why he goes for the move f3. He plays his pawn to f3. Now you can't take it. Imagine you play a move like d5, rook e5, attacking here and here. So Magnus now has to come up with a move. He goes h6. And I think this is the move that he is really proud of, because h6 is a move that stops bishop g5 ideas, can expand with g5. Also notice that you are putting the pawn on the same color as your opponent's bishop. But I think Magnus has seen deeper. d5 is played to get the rooks traded. We already discussed that the double rook trade is not very conducive for white. So maybe keeping the rooks on the board. Rook e5 makes a lot of sense. Magnus takes rook. Taking with the pawn doesn't make any sense as the king could blockade it very securely. So taking with the rook is definitely the idea. Now attacking the knight and the pawn. And here you see the value of the move h6. Knight e7 is played. And if it were not for the move h6, bishop g5 would come, making the knight move, and then he would chop off this pawn. Magnus thought few moves ahead there, and he's really able to now put pressure on Rauf. The threat now again is bishop d6. So rook c6, stopping bishop c6, bishop d6 ideas. It's amazing how Magnus is just continuously stopping opponents' plans. Bishop comes to e5. This position is by no means winning, but you have to play this with a lot of care. You have to kind of just figure out what is the next plan you want to make. And time-wise also, Magnus putting pressure on the clock. He has 27 minutes. Rauf has 7 minutes. King d2 played. And so rook a6. The rook puts pressure on the a2 pawn. a3. And rook comes to g6. Again, provoking a3 removes the options of b3 and makes the b2 pawn even more weak. So these are little subtle nuances. King e1. And now Magnus can give a check and put his rook on b1, where it would be very actively positioned. So check. King f2. and rook b1. So now the knight is beautifully positioned. The rook is beautifully positioned in a way that this pawn is so weak. So the white rook is tied up. The next question, of course, is what is your next plan to make progress? Rauf plays his bishop to c7. Maybe he wants to put his bishop on d8. In that way, he keeps controlling the e7 square. a6 played by Magnus. Waiting here. And he goes bishop to d8. King comes up to g6. Now the king is looking for something here. King h5. By the way, king g2. And remember, like even if you went in with a check, king h5, you have to come back because b2 pawn is severely weak. So king g2. And he finds king h5. Because rook e5, again impossible. I just simply take here with a check, king comes up, and g6, and black is completely better. So again, bishop c7 by Rauf. He's waiting here. For now, white is keeping everything under control. There are no issues. But Magnus always has more firepower up his sleeve. First a check. Okay. I guess you have to defend this pawn. So king f2 makes a lot of sense. And you can't come here to win the pawn because this pawn is already defended. And also rook e5 check is possible. So g5 played. Bishop comes back to g3, attacking the knight on h4. And you don't want to be giving up this knight perhaps because in the rook endgame you never know. So knight goes back to g6. But what's the future of this knight? Is it going to f4? I'm not so sure. King g2. Magnus often makes decisions which are a little bit curious. Rook d1 played. Now we understand. He wanted to stop rook e5. So the knight is placed here. So now he can reposition his rook. King h3. Maybe the mistake, the key error. King f2. Keeping the king here would have made Magnus's task even more difficult. But king h4. And now maybe first start with rook d3. Attacking the pawn on f3. Yes, he plays rook to d3. Attacking here. Now king g2. And here is where, there are two ideas. One is to play knight h4, take, and play this rook endgame. Not so sure what it is like. But the second one, a5, it looks definitely more promising. More promising because now b4 is a serious idea that Magnus has. Rauf is thinking hard here. He brings his king to f2. And we can now push forward with b4. This could be very, very important. Yes, he plays it. And this is a pawn sack. But after takes, Magnus comes back and he's going to recapture here. He takes back a b4. And now a very important maybe move is rook e3. Because if check, I can come back. And yes, this endgame is tough, but maybe it's holdable. Instead, he takes here, and this is a key mistake. Because, okay, if you take rook d4, b5 is equal. But Magnus finds his best move. And why is this the best? Because now b2 is under pressure, b4 is under pressure. You can't defend both. I mean, rook is defending here, so you definitely get your bishop and try to defend this pawn. So now white is a pawn up. But the problem now is that the bishop is a bit overloaded here, which means the knight can jump into h4 and attack this pawn. Incredible play. I mean, this just so brilliant step by step that Magnus has managed to create something here is just outstanding how he does it. Bishop c5, holding on to both these pawns. He takes the pawn on f3 with a check. King goes back to e1, and then now we go back to b3. Yes, rook to b3 played. And what are the next steps now? The next step could very well be, by the way, king d1. He also has to start moving faster. He has 1 minute 30 seconds. Magnus has 17 minutes. Knight could come to f3. g4. King moves away. h5, h4, g3. Create a passer there. Knight f3 first. First things first. The knight is improved. Here comes king c1. So now that the king is defending b2, bishop is defending these 2 pawns, the rook is free now to move. And will that help white is the question. Because while the rook can move, Magnus has created another weakness on h2 which the rook is tied to. Bishop d6. He tries to defend here. And he's saying that if you take on d4, I have check and I'll take this. So very careful you have to be in such positions. King h4 played. So the idea, h5, king h3, h4, g3. That's the plan. Rook e8. And h5 played. Rook goes to h8, stopping the progress for now. And now the only move is king g5. Again, Magnus finds it. He's always finding these ideas. Of course, the threat was bishop e7 check, winning the h5 pawn. So this was important. And now, if you give me a check, I'll go king g6. I'll keep the pawn on h5 defended. Rook goes to d8. And he wants to keep an eye on the d5 pawn here. King f5. I want to go king e4, attack d4. The rook comes to e8, stopping the black king from entering in. h4 played. And the rook comes back to e2. The rook tries to defend here. It's not going to be easy. Okay, firstly, Magnus to get g3 is tough. But he first goes rook d3. Again, correctly assessing the fact that b pawn is not running anywhere. If you play b5, I can go back and simply chop it off. So for the time being, he goes king b1, waits. And can Magnus now snatch the pawn on d4? I mean, taking with knight is not a great idea. You have rook e5 check. So first, maybe just rook d4. Yes. Oh, he takes with the knight? Wow. Things just change now. Check. Yeah, it's a check. He's attacking this. What is on Magnus's mind here? He goes king f6. And now if you take here on d5, I have check, king a2 and king e6. And you lose here. And so he resigns the game. Wow. Amazing. Rauf Mamedov congratulates Magnus because with this win, he takes the title. 8 out of 8 with 1 round to spare, he's the champion. And what amazing endgame play by Magnus Carlsen. I would rate this as one of his finest endgames that he has played. And even though this was freestyle chess, there's so much for everyone to learn. Maybe one of the greatest endgames of freestyle chess. We are getting all these instructive games in freestyle chess, and the database is building. And Magnus is at the forefront of all of this, playing some brilliant chess. Kudos to him. Kudos to Rauf Mamedov for giving a very, very big fight and also taking this loss as a sportsman. And here he talks about the queen trade. I think once the queens were traded, Magnus was in his element here. And yeah, that's for it. And Magnus in the last round will take on Vincent Keimer. And if he manages to win that, he would win the tournament with 9 out of 9. And this one more thing about Magnus, he always puts back the pieces in freestyle format, never as just normal chess. That's also interesting to note, while his opponents always put it back as standard chess positions.